All in Scarlet uniform is the fourth in the series about the 106th Foot and Hamish Williams and Hanley and Pringle and all the others. And this one begins in 1810. And it's set in one of the periods of the Peninsular War that tends to get written about rather less, because this story doesn't involve any of the really big battles. And in fact, when the story opens, our main characters are all back in Britain, and they've been withdrawn after Talavera, even though they were experienced troops. This was one of the patterns throughout the war, and something that would bother the Duke of Wellington later on, where experienced units were ground down in their numbers during the course of the war, mostly through attrition, mostly through disease, rather than enemy action, though obviously the big battles could have a heavy toll in casualties. But they were acclimatized. These veteran units were better at fighting. They knew the conditions of the Peninsular War. They knew how to march. They knew how to bivouac. They knew how to operate. Less disease prone because the weaker ones among them had already suffered and been lost, and the others had at least some immunity to the local infections. So Wellington used to complain that he'd much prefer to have kept the few hundred men of a veteran battalion rather than send them home and have in exchange a much larger unit, but one consisting of men who were less prepared for the rigours of campaigning, certainly not adapted to the conditions of Spain and Portugal, and also just less experienced all round. And this was particularly true after 1809 and the disastrous expedition to Walcheren Island, where the British Army failed in its objectives but suffered appalling losses through disease, Walcheren fever, possibly malaria. Other people have suggested other culprits. It might have been more than one infection involved. And battalions that had gone through that, even when men recovered, seemed rather sickly, prone to recurrences, which again might suggest a malarial element within this. But this was a problem that would grow as the war went on, that you used up the troops you had, but Wellington particularly was desperate to keep experienced men. But in this case, after Talavera, Williams, Hanley and Pringle have been sent home, and they are reunited with the rest of the 106th Foot, with Major MacAndrews, and of course particularly from the importance as far as Williams is concerned, Major MacAndrews' daughter, the lovely Jane. So this was a book where, again, rather like True Soldier Gentleman, I wanted to write just a little bit about life in England. So we have a duel right at the start, because again, gave me an opportunity to introduce another of the characters from Austen, one of those military gentlemen who appears but doesn't get to do very much. In this case, Tilney from Persuasion. And I've promoted him. He's still a light dragoon, and he's associated with a younger protege, rather an impressionable youngster within his regiment, who's got involved with one of Williams's sisters, one of the less sensible ones of his relatives. Hence a duel. Pringle's involved in William's place because Williams isn't there at the time. And we end up setting up some of the tension between the characters, but also hopefully getting to understand them all. Part of the idea of this saga was that we'd get to like them, we'd get to know them, that they're all flawed and foolish in their various ways, and they're all rather young as well. That's something I tried to emphasize throughout, the youth of the main characters. Sometimes heroes in stories tend to act as if they know everything already, and a lot of soldiers and a lot of young officers are just that. They're young. They haven't learned a lot about life as yet. So we start off in England, and then a reason is found for them to go back to Portugal and Spain, and in this case it's Major MacAndrews is sent out there to act as a teacher, an instructor to detachments of troops from the Spanish army. Now this is something that didn't actually happen but was talked about, and the British did of course send volunteers, NCOs and officers to help reorganize and retrain the Portuguese army, and the Portuguese army would emerge as an extraordinarily and very effective part of Wellington's forces, to the extent where really and truly there wasn't much difference between the British and the Portuguese regiments, particularly the infantry and to an extent the artillery. The Portuguese artillery was smaller as the war went on. You know, there's the famous story that Wellington would have desperately liked to have had Portuguese troops with him in the Waterloo campaign, but there simply wasn't time for them to be summoned and to get to Belgium before the campaign had opened. Now, the Spanish army was having great trouble reorganizing because, of course, when your country's been occupied, when your institutions have been taken over by the French, you're doing everything the hard way, trying to put together an army whilst you're also fighting a war against these veteran French divisions and corps that have come from all the experience of beating the rest of Europe is extremely difficult. And one thing that the Spanish regular army had difficulty with and didn't really have much practice in was skirmishing. So the idea in the story is that MacAndrews goes out to establish a school to train contingents of NCOs and soldiers from the Spanish army in the British methods of skirmishing, in the hope that then they can go back and train more of their own and gradually improve this element that was so vital in the battles of this period and was integral to the Duke of Wellington's tactics in particular. You had to win the skirmishing battle to stop the French coming forward and sniping and weakening your main line so much that any major attack would break through it. So that's the idea, and off he goes to Fort Concepcion, and a real place. And then they get involved in the campaign in early 1810 as the French under Massena send a very large army to invade Portugal, to finish the war once and for all. Perhaps if Napoleon had gone and had devoted all his full attention to this operation, it might have succeeded, but it very nearly succeeded even under Massena. And this would, of course, be thwarted by the Duke of Wellington constructing and manning the lines of Torres Vedras on the Lisbon Peninsula, so that although most of Portugal had to be abandoned and evacuated, he could not hope to defend it successfully against the French. He held on to the capital city itself, some of the land outside, and did so because there was a British fleet ready to take him off if things really went bad. But in fact, the French weren't able to break through this line of fortifications when they were so far ahead of their own supply lines. So this is a story of that conflict, but it's also a chance to see again the Spanish and the Portuguese contribution to the war, which often here in Britain we tend to dismiss and forget about and rather play down, particularly the Spanish. And one of the many heroic moments of Spanish fighting during the Great Peninsular War, and that was the defense of Ciudad Rodrigo. Now, Ciudad Rodrigo is famous here in Britain for the British siege that would storm the place early in 1812. And that was costly, and Black Bob Crawford of the Light Division would die as part of that assault. So there are lots of accounts of that. We know that story. It features in one of the Sharp novels, Sharp's Company, right at the very start. And, it's something we tend to know about. We hear less over here of the long and stubborn defence the Spanish mounted of this city 2 years before. And this was done even though Ciudad Rodrigo was not a modern fortress like Badajoz to the south. It was a medieval walled town that had been converted to some extent to cope with modern conditions. But the Spanish governor there held out, and in the story I get Williams and Pringle and Dobson and some of the others into the city, partly so they can see the Spanish doing this so with such courage and not being supported by the British. There were repeated pleas for Wellington to go and march to the relief of Ciudad Rodrigo. He did not. Now, in a purely pragmatic, strategic sense, he was probably right. The odds were, if he'd marched out and fought the French so far forward, that at best he might have fought to a draw, but he couldn't turn back the much larger French army that Massena had under his command. He certainly couldn't have defeated and driven them off, and he might well have suffered a serious defeat himself, which would have been the end of the British effort in the peninsula. So it made sense, but you could understand from a Spanish perspective there's a sense of being heavily let down by their British allies. Because Ciudad Rodrigo holds out for a long time, even though it's pounded by French artillery. And we see the siege from both sides. And one of the things I wanted to do in these stories was show different aspects of the war that we're maybe not quite so familiar with. So although we will get the British assaulting major cities later on and in some of the later stories, at this stage we actually see what it's like to defend a city in this period, how a siege works from the perspective of the defender, and we see it a little bit from the French perspective as well, partly because Hanley's operating as something rather like a spy, as being a little bit more than an exploring officer, but also from some of our French characters. Now the siege occurs very much as it did in reality in the story. Our heroes manage to escape. They then get caught up in a later action at the River Coa. I'm never quite sure of the pronunciation. I'm afraid I'm not very good with Portuguese and or Spanish, to be honest. I always sound like the Englishman, no matter how much in my mind the words sound better. But this again is one of those odd actions where Marshal Ney managed to surprise Crawford's light division, or what was becoming the light division. It was still the light brigade at this point. and fought a desperate action where the British really do get outmaneuvered, but they manage to retreat, and then they get across this narrow bridge over the river, and they hold that, because although the French try and very bravely attack across this narrow bridge, once the British and Portuguese have rallied on the other side, there is really no way that any enemy is going to be able to fight their way across that. The position is simply too strong, and the approach across a narrow bridge is too limited and restrictive to allow the French any real chance of success. They try anyway in the hope of rolling the enemy up, following on from their earlier victory. But again, it's a different sort of battle. It's not the standard, or the British, reverse slow, wait for the French attack, they beat back their skirmishers, then the British line meets the French columns and shatters them. It's a little bit different, it's a little bit more complicated, it's in many ways more exciting. And again, the wealth of personal accounts of people who were actually there provided so much material for this story. So we've got all the threads of our characters, the ongoing problematic romance between Williams and Jane, we've got complications raised by his sisters, Pringle's growing feelings for William's eldest sister, that we glimpse in the story, and we hear about in letters, and we see that way. And our characters are growing, they're developing. We also see old MacAndrews, the major who'd fought in America, who still shows just what a good soldier he is. And he takes the place of a real officer at the actual battle later on, who led a charge that helped to allow the rest of the British army to escape, or the British forces that were there. And again, it happens very much as it happened in reality. So we've gone from the calm of England, the world of Jane Austen, but also of duels, the world of recruiting parties going around the towns, trying to persuade the desperate, often, as well as the patriotic and the enthusiastic and the naive, to join the army and take all the risks of a soldier. The title, All in Scarlet Uniform, as with all the titles of these books, comes from a song from the period that went to the tune that we now know as the far more famous Waltzing Matilda. And it's interesting to see these sort of folk memories and how they reflect that perception of the wars, the conflicts, what it meant to go for a soldier, the risks involved, and who was likely to choose. So I hope it's another interesting installment in the saga, and it was certainly a lot of fun to write, and already by this time, this is the fourth book, you get more and more fond of all your characters as you write a series. So this is another step on their journey that will hopefully still eventually lead them to Waterloo, though as I've explained before, I'm not sure when that'll happen. But that's All in Scarlet Uniform, and in the next book, Run Them Ashore, we get to see yet another, I hope, different aspect of the Peninsular War. But we'll talk about that another time.